My wife's uncle's reckless son hit my daughter and fled. Wife's uncle, the CEO, called me. My son has immunity. I own the judge. Drop it. I replied. You have no idea who you are talking with. You have 10 minutes to turn him in. The CEO laughed. 9 minutes later, his lawyer called me. Who the hell are you? We're ready to accept all of your terms. Just stop what you started. Let me tell you something about the moment your whole damn world gets flipped upside down like a pancake in a tornado. It usually starts with something as innocent as a phone buzzing on your desk. I was knee-deep in a stack of essays about the Revolutionary War, red pen bleeding all over some kid's creative interpretation of why Benedict Arnold was totally justified. Mr. Hale, because the Continental Army had, really bad health care, when my phone started vibrating like it was having some kind of electronic seizure. The name on the screen made my stomach do that thing where it forgets how gravity works for a hot second. Ria. My wife doesn't call during school hours unless someone's dying or the house is on fire. And even then, she'd probably text first because she's considerate like that. I swiped to answer, and what I heard damn near made me drop the phone like it was a live grenade. Ria was sobbing. Not the pretty kind of crying you see in movies, but the ugly, soul-deep kind that sounds like someone's trying to breathe underwater while their heart's getting ripped out through their throat. Marcus, she gasped between hitches that made my chest tighten. There's been an accident. Iris. Oh God. Marcus, she's at Mercy General. You know that feeling when an elevator drops too fast and your stomach tries to escape through your mouth? Yeah, multiply that by about 1,000 and you're getting close to what happened to me in that moment. The red pen fell from my fingers, landing on Tommy Brennan's essay with a splat that looked way too much like blood for my liking. What happened? I managed to croak out, but the rational part of my brain, the part that usually keeps me from doing spectacularly stupid things, had already checked out for the day. My body was moving on autopilot, shoving papers into my bag like they actually mattered, grabbing my keys with hands that suddenly felt like they belonged to someone else. Hit and run, Ria choked out. She was walking home from Emma's house, and, Marcus, they just left her there. On the street, like she was nothing. I've heard people say that time slows down during emergencies, but that's complete horseshit. Time doesn't slow down. It turns into this weird, elastic thing that stretches and snaps without warning. 1 second, I was in my classroom surrounded by the familiar smell of whiteboard markers and teenage desperation, and the next, I was behind the wheel of my beat-up Honda, driving like I was auditioning for Fast and Furious. Teacher's revenge. The drive to Mercy General usually takes about 25 minutes if you obey all those pesky little suggestions like speed limits and traffic laws. I made it in 12, and let me tell you, I ran more red lights than a colorblind NASCAR driver. Every intersection was a gamble, every yellow light was a personal challenge, and every slow-moving minivan was a conspiracy designed specifically to keep me from my daughter. The emergency room at Mercy General smells like industrial disinfectant mixed with fear and broken dreams. It's a scent that hits you like a slap in the face and sticks to your clothes for weeks afterward. I burst through those automatic doors like some kind of deranged superhero, wild-eyed, and probably looking like I'd just escaped from a psychiatric facility. Ria was in the waiting area, hunched over in one of those uncomfortable plastic chairs that hospitals must buy specifically to make bad situations worse. Her mascara had taken a scenic tour down her cheeks, and she was clutching a tissue that looked like it had been through a paper shredder. Where is she? I asked, though it came out more like a growl than actual human speech. Before Ria could answer, a woman in scrubs approached us with the kind of measured calm that medical professionals perfect after seeing every possible variation of human tragedy. Dr. Lillian Meadows, according to her name tag, looked like she'd been working in emergency medicine since the invention of Band-Aids. She had those steady eyes that had seen everything and the gentle voice that delivered bad news like it was a science. Mr. and Mrs. Hale? She asked, though she already knew the answer. I'm Dr. Meadows. I've been treating Iris. This is the part where time did that elastic thing again. Dr. Meadows started talking, fractured ribs, concussion, bruised lung, jagged cut on her arm that would leave a scar, but the words felt like they were coming through water. My brain kept trying to process the information while simultaneously rejecting it, like a computer trying to run software it wasn't designed for. She's stable, Dr. Meadows continued, and that word, stable, became my new favorite word in the English language. The injuries are serious, but not life-threatening. She's sedated right now, but you can see her. Ria's hands were shaking like autumn leaves in a hurricane, so I took them in mine and held on tight. My voice, when I finally found it, sounded steadier than I felt. Thank you, doctor. When can we take her home? We'll need to monitor her for at least 48 hours, she explained. Head injuries require careful observation, and we want to make sure there are no complications with the lung contusion. That's when Detective Luis Ortega made his entrance, following a uniformed patrol officer who looked like he'd rather be literally anywhere else on the planet. Ortega had that particular brand of tired that comes from dealing with humanity's greatest hits on a daily basis, but his eyes were sharp and focused. Mr. and Mrs. Hale? I'm Detective Ortega. I'm investigating the incident involving your daughter. He laid out the facts like he was reading from a grocery list, but each item hit like a punch to the gut. A matte black sports car running a red light at 50+ miles per hour. The driver fled the scene, leaving my 13-year-old daughter bleeding on the asphalt like roadkill. Two witnesses who were too shocked to get a clear look at the license plate, but they managed to catch a partial, enough to trace the car. The vehicle is registered to Trent Voss, Ortega said, and I watched Ria's face go about 3 shades paler. He's the son of Alistair Voss. Well, shit. Alistair Voss, CEO of Voss Meridian Group, local big shot, and more importantly, Ria's uncle. The same Uncle Alistair who sent expensive Christmas presents and made sure everyone knew exactly how much they cost. The guy who treated family gatherings like board meetings and spoke about people like they were quarterly earnings reports. Ria closed her eyes like she was trying to make the whole situation disappear through sheer force of will. Oh God, Marcus. Trent's always been reckless, but this is attempted vehicular manslaughter with failure to render aid. I said, my teacher voice automatically switching to the tone I used when explaining why cheating on tests was a spectacularly bad idea. This is leaving a child to die in the street. Detective Ortega nodded grimly. We're working on locating Mr. Trent Voss now. He hasn't been home since yesterday, and his phone's been going straight to voicemail. After Ortega left with promises to keep us updated, Ria and I were finally allowed to see Iris. Walking down that hospital corridor felt like the longest journey of my life, each step echoing off the sterile walls like a countdown to something I wasn't sure I was ready for. She looked so small in that hospital bed, surrounded by machines that beeped and hummed like electronic lullabies. Wires and tubes connected her to various monitors, and there was a thick bandage wrapped around her left arm where the scar would be. Her face was bruised, one eye swollen shut, but she was breathing steadily, and that was enough for now. I sat down in the chair beside her bed, took her uninjured hand in mine, and made a promise out loud, partly to her, partly to myself, and partly to whatever cosmic force might be listening. I'm going to make sure the person who did this faces consequences, I whispered. Real consequences, not the kind of justice that money can buy, but the kind that actually means something. As I sat there watching my daughter sleep, feeling the steady rhythm of her breathing, something inside me shifted. It was like a door opening in a part of my mind that I'd kept locked for years, the part I'd deliberately buried when Ria and I decided we wanted a quiet life, a safe life, a normal life. But normal was apparently off the table now. And quiet? Well, quiet was about to become a thing of the past, the old part of me, the part that knew how to find pressure points and leverage, the part that understood how power really worked and where the bodies were buried, stretched and yawned like it was waking up from a long nap. Time to get to work. You know what's funny about family? Not funny haha, but funny in that twisted, cosmic joke kind of way that makes you wonder if the universe has a seriously warped sense of humor. One minute you're all gathered around the Thanksgiving table pretending to like each other's potato salad, and the next minute one branch of the family tree is trying to kill another branch with a 2-ton death machine. While Iris slept off her pharmaceutical cocktail of painkillers and sedatives, looking like a tiny warrior who'd lost a battle with a freight train, my phone started lighting up like a Christmas tree in Times Square. Ria's family had apparently activated their emergency phone tree. You know, that ancient communication system that works faster than CNN and twice as unreliably. First it was Cousin Janet, calling from Phoenix with that breathy voice she uses when she's about to deliver gossip that's too juicy for Facebook. Oh my God, Marcus, we just heard about Iris. Is it true it was a hit and run? Do they know who did it? Then came Aunt Patricia from Milwaukee, who somehow managed to make even genuine concern sound like she was auditioning for a soap opera. Rhea, honey, we're all just devastated. If there's anything, and I mean anything, we can do. Uncle Bob called from his fishing boat somewhere off the coast of Florida, shouting over what sounded like a hurricane, but was probably just his ancient outboard motor. Tell that son of a bitch whoever hit our girl that he'd better hope the cops find him before I do. Each call was like a small earthquake, shaking Rhea a little more, making her shoulders hunch further inward. She'd answer with the same tired voice, deliver the same basic facts, accept the same hollow condolences, and hang up looking like she'd aged another year. But then, around 9:30 that night, my phone lit up with a number I didn't have saved in my contacts. I knew exactly who it was, though. You develop an instinct for these things when you've spent years reading people like they're badly written instruction manuals. I stepped out into the hallway, away from Iris's room and the steady beeping of her monitors, and answered on the fourth ring. No reason to seem eager. Marcus. The voice was smooth as aged whiskey and twice as toxic. Alistair Voss didn't bother with pleasantries like hello, or how's my great niece doing after my psychopath son tried to turn her into street pizza. Alistair. I kept my voice level, conversational, like we were discussing the weather instead of attempted vehicular homicide. I assume you've heard about this unfortunate situation involving Trent and young Iris. Unfortunate situation. Jesus Christ. The man had a gift for turning attempted murder into corporate speak. I bet he called the Titanic an unplanned aquatic event. I've heard, I said, watching a nurse hurry past with an armload of 4 bags. Your boy left my daughter bleeding on the street like roadkill, then fled the scene. So yeah, I'd say I'm caught up on current events. There was a pause. Not the kind where someone's thinking, but the kind where someone's recalibrating their approach after realizing their first strategy just belly flopped. Marcus, I need you to understand something. His voice dropped to that confidential tone that rich people use when they're about to explain how the world really works to us poor, naive peasants. My son has immunity. I own the judge who'll be handling this case. The investigating detective owes me favors that go back years. This whole thing is going to disappear faster than a snowball in hell. I had to give him credit. The man didn't waste time with subtlety. No dancing around. No veiled threats. Just straight-up corruption delivered with the confidence of someone who'd never faced real consequences for anything in his entire privileged life. So here's what's going to happen, he continued, and I could practically hear him leaning back in whatever ridiculously expensive chair he was sitting in. You're going to drop this. You're going to tell that detective that you don't want to press charges. You're going to accept a generous settlement. Let's say $2 million, and we're all going to move on with our lives. I looked through the window into Iris's room, where my daughter lay connected to machines that were keeping track of her broken body. Rhea was asleep in the chair beside the bed, her hand resting on Iris's arm, like she could somehow transfer her own strength through osmosis. You finished? I asked. I'm sorry. Your little speech about immunity and own judges and generous settlements. You done? Another pause. This one felt different, less confident, more uncertain. Marcus, I don't think you understand the gravity of, no, Alistair. I interrupted, and I let the last bit of fear slide off me like water off a duck's back. You don't understand. You have absolutely no idea who you're talking to. The silence stretched between us like a tightrope, and I could practically feel him trying to process what I'd just said. In his world, threats went in one direction, down the hierarchy. Rich people threatened poor people, powerful people threatened powerless people, and everyone knew their place in the food chain. You have 10 minutes to turn Trent in. I continued, my voice steady as a metronome. 10 minutes to have him walk into the nearest police station and confess to what he did. 10 minutes to prove that somewhere in that empty chest cavity where your heart should be, there's maybe a microscopic speck of human decency. Are you threatening me? He sounded genuinely incredulous, like I'd just announced my intention to challenge gravity to a fist fight. I'm giving you a choice, I said. The easy way or the hard way. Your call. He laughed, actually laughed. It was the kind of laugh that rich sociopaths make when they think they're dealing with someone who doesn't understand how the game is played. Rich, condescending, and absolutely dripping with the kind of arrogance that comes from never having to face the consequences of your actions. Marcus, you're a high school teacher from the suburbs. I own half this city and have the other half on speed dial. What exactly do you think you're going to do to me? I ended the call without answering and walked back into Iris's room. The monitors were still beeping their electronic lullaby, and Rhea had shifted in her sleep so that her head was resting on the side of the bed, her hand still protectively covering our daughter's arm. That I sat down in the empty chair and pulled out my phone again, scrolling to a contact I hadn't called in over 3 years. The number still worked. I kept it active, just in case. You never really leave some jobs behind. You just put them on standby. But first, I started counting, out loud, in a whisper that was barely audible over the hospital's ambient noise. 1 Mississippi, 2 Mississippi, 3 Mississippi. Alistair Voss thought he knew how the world worked. He thought money was power, influence was armor, and corruption was just another business expense. He thought he was playing chess while everyone else was playing checkers. For Mississippi, 5 Mississippi, 6 Mississippi. What he didn't understand was that there are some games where money doesn't matter, where influence is just noise, and where the most dangerous opponent is someone who has nothing left to lose and everything they need to win. 7 Mississippi, 8 Mississippi. I looked at my daughter's sleeping face, at the bandages and bruises that would heal but never disappear completely from my memory, and felt something cold and precise click into place in my chest. 9 Mississippi. Time's up, Uncle Alistair. Class is in session, and today's lesson is about consequences. Let me tell you something about power, real power, not the fake kind that comes with corner offices and country club memberships. Real power is knowing exactly when someone's bluffing, and more importantly, knowing when they're about to shit their pants because they just realized they're not playing the game they thought they were playing. At exactly 9 minutes. And I was counting, because precision matters in situations like this. My phone rang. Different number this time, but the area code told me everything I needed to know. Local, corporate, and definitely not Alistair. I let it ring 4 times before answering, because desperation has a sound, and I wanted to hear it clearly. Mr. Hale. The voice was female, crisp, professional, and already sweating bullets despite the air conditioning that was probably cranked to Arctic levels in whatever glass tower she was calling from. This is Dana Whitcomb, Chief Counsel for Voss Meridian Group. Bingo. They'd wheeled out the legal artillery. Nothing says, we're taking this seriously, like having your top lawyer make house calls at 9:40 on a Tuesday night. Ms. Whitcomb, I said, settling back in the uncomfortable hospital chair and watching a nurse check Iris's 4-line with practiced efficiency. Working late tonight. Mr. Hale, I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer honestly. Her voice had that particular quality that lawyers develop when they're trying to sound calm while internally screaming. Who the hell are you? I almost smiled. Almost. I'm a high school teacher, Ms. Whitcomb. I teach American history and civics. You know, boring stuff like the Constitution and how the justice system is supposed to work. Cut the shit. The professional veneer cracked just enough to let some genuine panic leak through. In the last 6 minutes, I've had 3 separate board members call me in a panic. Judge Reeves just filed an emergency medical recusal from all active cases. The mayor's office is suddenly very interested in reviewing our municipal contracts. And somehow, the IRS has decided that tonight is the perfect time to schedule a surprise audit of our charitable foundation. Now I did smile, though she couldn't see it through the phone. Sometimes the beautiful thing about corruption is that it's like a house of cards built on a foundation of jello. One tiny poke, and the whole thing starts wobbling. Sounds like you folks are having a rough evening, I said. Maybe you should try turning it off and turning it back on again. Mr. Hale. Her voice dropped to that desperate whisper that people use when they're trying to negotiate with a hurricane. We're prepared to accept all of your terms. Whatever they are. Just stop. Whatever you started. I looked through the window at Iris, who had shifted slightly in her sleep. The bruising on her face looked even worse under the harsh hospital lighting, all purple and yellow like some kind of abstract art painted with pain. Here are my terms, I said, and I let my teacher voice take over, the one I used when I was explaining something important that they'd definitely be tested on later. Full surrender. Tonight. I want Trent's confession, complete and unedited. I want full toxicology results. I want any dash cam footage he might have tried to hide. and I want it untouched. I want the car delivered to the police impound lot, exactly as it was, with every piece of evidence intact. Done, she said immediately. What else? You will not contact Detective Ortega. You will not call Judge Reeves, or whoever replaces him. You will not tamper with witness statements or evidence or so much as a single byte of data. All deliverables go directly to Detective Ortega at 9:00 a.m. sharp tomorrow morning. Understood. Anything else? Then we talk about restitution and community impact. Not hush money, not settlements, not checks with lots of zeros designed to make this go away. We talk about what it's going to take to make this right. The silence stretched for about 10 seconds, long enough for her to realize that her client's usual playbook had just been fed into a paper shredder. Mr. Hale, she said finally, may I ask, what's your background? Because I've been practicing law for 23 years, and I've never seen anyone dismantle a defense strategy this efficiently without filing a single motion. I told you, I said. I'm a teacher. I believe in accountability, consequences, and making sure everyone does their homework. After I hung up, I pulled out my phone and sent a quick text to Detective Ortega. Evidence will land tomorrow morning. Be ready. His response came back almost immediately. What kind of evidence? The kind that makes cases airtight, I typed back. The kind that ambitious prosecutors dream about. Rhea stirred in her chair, blinking awake with that disoriented look that people get when they fall asleep in hospital furniture. Was that your phone? She whispered. Just some folks who wanted to discuss their evening plans, I said. Go back to sleep, babe. Everything's under control. She gave me that look, the one that said she knew I was up to something but was too tired to interrogate me about it. Marcus, please tell me you're not about to do something that's going to end up with you in jail. I'm not going to jail, I said, and I meant it. I'm just making sure that the right person does. She closed her eyes again, but I could tell she wasn't really sleeping. Rhea's always been able to read me like a book, probably because I'm about as subtle as a freight train most of the time. But this was different. This was the part of me that she'd only heard stories about, the part that existed before we met, before we fell in love, before we decided that quiet suburban life was what we wanted. I looked at my phone again, scrolling through contacts I hadn't touched in years. Names and numbers of people who owed me favors, people who knew how the real world worked behind the scenes, people who could move pieces on boards that most folks didn't even know existed. But I didn't need favors for this. I didn't need shadow networks or off-the-books operations or any of the cloak and dagger bullshit that made for good movies but terrible real life. All I needed was patience, pressure, and the understanding that even the most carefully constructed house of lies has structural weaknesses. Alistair Voss thought his money made him untouchable. He thought his connections made him immune. He thought his influence made him powerful. What he didn't understand was that real power doesn't come from what you can buy. It comes from what you're willing to lose. And right now, looking at my daughter's bandaged face, I had a perfect clarity about exactly what I was willing to sacrifice to make sure justice got served. And my phone buzzed with another text, this one from an unknown number. Package will be delivered as requested. No further contact necessary. I deleted the message and settled back in the chair. Tomorrow morning, Detective Ortega was going to have the kind of Christmas that cops spend their entire careers hoping for. A case so airtight that even a public defender fresh out of law school could get a conviction. And Alistair Voss was going to learn that sometimes the most dangerous opponent isn't the one with the most resources. It's the one with the least to lose. Class dismissed, motherfucker. Here's the thing about reinventing yourself. It's a lot like trying to quit smoking. You can throw away all your cigarettes, avoid your old smoking buddies, and tell everyone you meet that you're a reformed nicotine addict who's all about clean living and yoga retreats. But that doesn't mean the muscle memory disappears. It doesn't mean you stop knowing exactly where to buy a pack at 3 in the morning, or that your fingers forget how to hold a lighter. That I'm a high school teacher. That's what it says on my business cards, my tax returns, and the little nameplate outside room 237 where I spend my days trying to convince teenagers that the Battle of Gettysburg wasn't actually a video game. I've got the khaki pants, the coffee-stained ties, and the perpetual look of someone who's explained the same concept 17 different ways and is gearing up for attempt number 18. But there's a file with my name on it sitting in a windowless room in DC that tells a very different story. A file that says I used to do work that didn't involve lesson plans or parent-teacher conferences, or explaining to administrators why Jimmy Patterson's essay about World War II consisted entirely of the phrase "Hitler was bad," repeated for 3 pages. The official term was intelligence analyst, which sounds about as exciting as watching paint dry in slow motion. The reality was more like being a professional puzzle solver for people who collected secrets the way other folks collected baseball cards. I was good at finding patterns, connecting dots, and figuring out how to apply exactly the right amount of pressure in exactly the right spot to make very bad people have very bad days. That I retired from that life when Rhea and I got married. Not because I was burned out or traumatized or any of that Hollywood bullshit, but because I wanted something normal, something clean, something that didn't require me to lie about what I did for a living when people asked at barbecues. But here's the beautiful thing about skills like mine: they don't rust. They just sit there in the back of your brain like tools in a garage, waiting patiently for the day when you need to fix something that regular tools can't handle. After Dana Whitcomb's panic-stricken phone call, I walked down to the hospital cafeteria and bought the worst cup of coffee in recorded human history. I sat in a corner booth under fluorescent lighting that made everyone look like extras from a zombie movie, and I pulled out my phone. The number I dialed belonged to Merrick Quinn, my old handler. The one person on the planet who knew exactly which strings were legal to pull and which ones would get you a free trip to a federal penitentiary. Merrick was the guy who taught me that you didn't need guns or explosives or any of that action movie nonsense when you had patience, leverage, and a solid understanding of how bureaucracies actually functioned. Marcus Hale, Marek's voice came through the phone like gravel in a cement mixer. I was wondering when you'd call. You heard. I hear everything, kid. Your daughter okay? She will be. I took a sip of the coffee and immediately regretted every life choice that had led me to that moment. I need some information, Merrick. Public records, corporate structures, board minutes, contract paths, and judges whose mortgages don't make sense. You really do hear everything. Merrick chuckled, and I could picture him in whatever bunker he was working out of these days, surrounded by monitors and files and the accumulated paranoia of 30 years in the intelligence game. What's the target? Voss Meridian Group. Alistair Voss specifically. And before you ask, this is personal, but it's clean. No black ops, no off-books favors, nothing that's going to show up in anybody's congressional hearing. Just good old-fashioned sunlight and transparency. The most dangerous weapons in the arsenal. Give me 4 hours. He hung up without saying goodbye, which was vintage Merrick. The man had about as much use for social pleasantries as a fish had for a bicycle, but he could dissect a corporate structure faster than a master chef could fillet a salmon. That I finished my toxic waste coffee and headed back upstairs to Iris's room. Rhea was awake again, sitting beside the bed and reading one of those magazines that hospitals keep around to make sure their patients don't die of boredom before their actual medical conditions can kill them. How's she doing? I asked, settling into the chair on the other side of the bed. Better. Her vitals are stable, and the doctor thinks they might be able to reduce some of the pain medication tomorrow. Rhea looked at me with those eyes that missed absolutely nothing. What are you up to, Marcus? Research, I said, which was technically true. Research into what? The Voss family business practices. You know, just making sure I understand who we're dealing with. She closed the magazine and gave me the full intensity of her attention. Marcus, I know you. I know that look. You're planning something. I'm planning to make sure that the person who hit our daughter faces appropriate consequences for his actions. That's what any parent would do. Most parents would let the police handle it. Most parents don't have a daughter lying in a hospital bed because some rich asshole's kid thinks traffic laws are suggestions. My phone buzzed with the first batch of information from Merrick. Corporate filings, board memberships, contract awards, property records. The kind of publicly available information that most people never bothered to look at because it was boring as hell and written in language that made legal documents look like children's books. But if you knew how to read between the lines, if you understood how shell companies worked and why certain contracts got awarded to certain bidders, the picture that emerged was more beautiful than anything hanging in the Louvre. Voss Meridian Group wasn't just a construction company. It was a carefully constructed web of subsidiaries, partnerships, and consulting relationships that had tentacles reaching into city planning, county contracts, state infrastructure projects, and federal procurement processes. Nothing illegal on the surface, but everything designed to maximize profit while minimizing oversight. More information kept flowing in. Judges who'd received generous campaign contributions, city council members who'd voted on suspiciously profitable zoning changes, inspectors who'd somehow missed obvious safety violations on Voss construction sites that by 3 in the morning. I had a complete picture of how Alistair Voss had built his little empire. It was actually impressive in a deeply corrupt sort of way, like watching a master craftsman build a house of cards during an earthquake. The beautiful thing about corruption is that it requires darkness to survive. It thrives in shadows, in backroom deals, in handshake agreements that never get written down. But corruption is also fragile. It only works as long as everyone involved agrees to keep quiet and look the other way. All you have to do is turn on the lights that I wasn't going to break any laws. I didn't need to. I was just going to make sure that every reporter, every prosecutor, every regulatory agency, and every ethics committee in the state had access to the same publicly available information that I was looking at. Sometimes the most devastating weapon in the world is a really bright flashlight. There's something deeply satisfying about walking into a lion's den when you know exactly where all the lions are sleeping and which ones have forgotten to sharpen their claws. The Voss Meridian Group tower squatted in the downtown business district like a glass and steel middle finger pointed at the sky. All sharp angles and reflective surfaces designed to make visitors feel small and insignificant. That I walked through the lobby at exactly 8:30 a.m., wearing my best teacher clothes. The navy blazer I saved for parent conferences and the tie Rhea bought me for Christmas that still had the tags on it until yesterday. I probably looked like someone who'd gotten lost on his way to a PDA meeting, which was exactly the point. The lobby was all marble and intimidation, with abstract art that cost more than my annual salary and a reception desk that looked like mission control for the International Space Station. The receptionist, a woman in her 20s who'd probably been hired more for her ability to look decorative than her typing skills, gave me the kind of smile that rich people's employees use when they're not sure if you're supposed to be there. "Can I help you?" she asked, and her voice had that practiced sweetness that came with a side order of condescension. "I'm here to see Beverly Klein," I said, handing her a business card that identified me as exactly what I was, a public school teacher from the suburbs. "I don't have an appointment, but I think she'll want to see me." Beverly Klein was Alistair's chief of staff, the woman who managed his calendar, filtered his phone calls, and probably knew where he buried the bodies. According to Marek's research, she'd been with the company for 15 years, which meant she'd seen every dirty deal and backroom handshake that had built this empire. The receptionist made a phone call, speaking in hushed tones like she was discussing state secrets. After a few minutes of whispering and meaningful glances in my direction, she hung up and pointed toward the elevators. 23rd floor. "Miss Klein will meet you." The elevator ride was smooth as silk and twice as expensive, with buttons that probably cost more than my car. Soft jazz played from hidden speakers, and everything smelled like money and leather polish. I spent the ride thinking about Iris, about the way she'd looked that morning when the nurse had helped her sit up to eat some Jell-O. The bruising was fading, but the scar on her arm would be permanent, a daily reminder that some people thought consequences were for other folks. Beverly Klein was waiting when the elevator doors opened, and she looked exactly like Central Casting would order if they needed someone to play corporate ice queen. Perfectly styled gray hair, a suit that probably cost more than my mortgage payment, and eyes that could freeze hell over. "Mr. Hale," she said, extending a hand that felt like shaking hands with a mannequin. "I understand you wanted to speak with Mr. Voss." "That's right," I said, following her down a corridor lined with photographs of construction projects and ribbon-cutting ceremonies. "We have some family business to discuss." She led me to a conference room with floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a panoramic view of the city. The table was large enough to land a helicopter on, and the chairs looked like they'd been designed by someone who thought comfort was a sign of weakness. "Mr. Voss will be with you shortly," she said, then left me alone with my thoughts and the knowledge that I was probably being recorded from 6 different angles that I didn't have to wait long. Alistair Voss entered the room like he owned it, which, technically, he did, accompanied by that particular brand of arrogance that comes from never having to face real consequences for anything. He was tall, silver-haired, and wearing a suit that cost more than most people's cars. Everything about him screamed power, money, and the kind of confidence that came from buying your way out of every problem you'd ever encountered. Marcus, he said, like we were old fishing buddies meeting at the local bar. Good to finally meet face to face. He didn't offer to shake hands, which was probably wise. Instead, he walked over to the windows and stood with his back to me, looking out over his kingdom like Caesar surveying Rome. Hell of a view, isn't it? He said. 23 floors up, you can see everything. The whole city spread out like a map. From up here, people look like ants. Funny thing about ants, I said, settling into one of the uncomfortable chairs. They're small individually, but they can carry 20 times their own weight. And when they work together, they can bring down things a lot bigger than themselves. He turned around, and for the first time since I'd met him, he looked genuinely curious. You're not what I expected. What were you expecting? Someone angrier. Someone more emotional. He walked over to the table, but didn't sit down. Most people in your situation would be screaming, making threats, demanding blood. I'm not most people. No, he said slowly. You're not. He leaned against the table, close enough that I could smell his cologne, something expensive that probably came in bottles shaped like Greek statues. So let's talk business. I assume you're here about my offer. What offer? The settlement. 2 million, like I mentioned last night. Clean, simple, everyone moves on with their lives. I looked at him for a long moment, then pulled out my phone and checked the time. 9:15. Your lawyer promised Detective Ortega a full evidence package at 9 o'clock sharp. I hope she's punctual. His expression didn't change, but something shifted behind his eyes, like a light switching off in a distant room. You think you're clever. I think I'm thorough. You have no idea what you're dealing with, Marcus. This isn't some classroom where you get to play teacher and everyone follows the rules. This is the real world, where power matters and connections determine outcomes. You call your influence immunity, I said, standing up and walking over to join him by the windows. It's not. It's dust. Is that supposed to be some kind of threat? It's an observation. I looked out at the city below, at all the people going about their lives, unaware that their morning commute was being observed by a man who thought he was God. You've spent decades building this empire on bribes, backroom deals, and bought judges. But empires built on corruption have a fatal flaw, which is, they require darkness to survive. And darkness is just the absence of light. His phone buzzed. He glanced at it, and I watched his face change, just a slight tightening around the eyes, but enough to tell me that Judge Hartley Reeves had just made his surprise medical recusal official. That wasn't my doing. That was the judge feeling the heat of impending scrutiny and deciding he'd rather spend time with his family than explain his financial relationships to a federal ethics committee. Problems? I asked. Minor complications. But his voice had lost some of its smooth confidence. Nothing that can't be managed. You know what I find interesting about your operation? I said, walking back toward the conference table. It's incredibly sophisticated. Shell companies, consulting agreements, strategic campaign contributions. You've built a machine that converts public money into private profit with the efficiency of a Swiss watch. Business is business. But machines have moving parts. And moving parts can break. I picked up my jacket from the chair where I'd left it. Especially when someone starts asking uncomfortable questions about why certain contracts got awarded to certain companies, or why certain judges consistently rule in favor of certain defendants. Another buzz from his phone. This one made him actually look at the screen, and I saw his jaw tighten. Probably another domino falling. Maybe the mayor's office announcing a comprehensive review of municipal contracts, or the state attorney general's office expressing sudden interest in construction industry oversight. What do you want? He asked, and for the first time, he sounded like someone who was negotiating instead of dictating terms. I want your son to face consequences for what he did. Real consequences. Not the kind that money can buy, but the kind that actually means something. And if I arrange that, then we talk about restitution and community impact. We talk about making things right instead of making them disappear. I headed toward the door, then paused with my hand on the handle. Oh, and Alistair? That view from 23 floors up? It works both ways. People down there can see you too. I left him standing by the windows, staring at his reflection in the glass, and probably wondering which mirror was lying. Time to see how well his empire handled a little sunlight. You know what they say about chains? They're only as strong as their weakest link. And in the Voss family chain, Trent was definitely the link that looked like it had been forged out of tin foil and bad decisions. While his daddy was busy playing power games in his glass tower, Junior was holed up like a cockroach in the kind of place that rich kids go when they want to pretend they're rebels. The Crimson Room was one of those exclusive speakeasies that charged $50 for a cocktail and made you feel sophisticated for drinking in a basement. It was hidden behind a fake bookshelf in what used to be a legitimate restaurant, because apparently nothing says, "I'm a serious adult," like pretending you're living through Prohibition that I didn't go myself. That would have been like sending a school principal to negotiate with teenagers. Instead, I made a phone call to Armin Woodard, a defense attorney who had two qualities that made him perfect for this job. He had a spine, and he had a conscience. In a profession where those features were about as common as unicorns, Armin was practically a mythical creature. I'd known Armin for about 5 years, ever since he'd volunteered to speak at our school's career day and spend an hour explaining to my students why, because it pays well, was a shitty reason to become a lawyer. He was one of those rare attorneys who got into law because he actually believed in justice, not just because he wanted to drive a BMW and intimidate people at dinner parties. "You want me to do what?" Armin asked when I called him that morning. I was sitting in the hospital cafeteria, nursing another cup of coffee that tasted like it had been filtered through a gym sock, while Rhea stayed upstairs with Iris. "I want you to have a conversation with Trent Voss," I said. "A very specific kind of conversation about choices and consequences. Marcus, I can't just walk up to someone and offer legal advice. That's not how attorney-client privilege works. You're not offering advice. You're presenting options. Think of it as a public service announcement about the legal system." There was a pause, and I could practically hear him thinking. Armin was smart enough to know that I wouldn't be calling him unless I had all my ducks in a row, but he was also ethical enough to worry about crossing lines that shouldn't be crossed. "What kind of options?" he asked finally. "The kind that help young Mr. Voss understand exactly how fucked he is, and exactly how unfucked he could be if he makes better choices than his old man." 2 hours later, Armin called me back with a report that was better than I'd dared hope for. "Jesus Christ, Marcus," he said, and I could hear traffic in the background, which meant he was probably walking somewhere he didn't want to be overheard. "That kid is a mess. I found him exactly where you said he'd be, drunk off his ass at 2 in the afternoon, surrounded by empty whiskey bottles and the kind of friends who disappear the second real trouble shows up. How'd he take your little presentation? Like someone who just realized he's been swimming with sharks while wearing a meat suit." Armin's voice had that mix of professional satisfaction and human sympathy that good lawyers develop. "I laid it out for him, Marcus. All of it. The charges he's looking at, the evidence that's already been collected, the witnesses who saw him flee the scene." I leaned back in my uncomfortable cafeteria chair, watching a janitor mop the floors with the kind of methodical precision that comes from doing the same job for 20 years. And then I explained his options. Door number 1. Ride his daddy's fantasy of immunity straight into a stack of charges that would make a federal prosecutor weep with joy. Vehicular assault, leaving the scene of an accident, reckless endangerment, and that's just for starters. With his priors, did you know he's got 2 DUIs and a reckless driving charge from college? He's looking at serious time. What about door number 2? Door number 2 is where things get interesting. Turn himself in, cooperate fully, show genuine remorse, accept counseling and community service in addition to whatever sentence he gets. With the right judge and a demonstration of real accountability, maybe he's looking at 18 months to 2 years, eligible for parole if he keeps his nose clean. I felt something unclench in my chest. Not relief, exactly, but the satisfaction of watching a plan come together. How'd he respond? Like someone who just discovered that actions have consequences and daddy's money can't solve everything. Armin paused, and I heard a car door slam. "Marcus, I have to ask, how did you know he'd be there? And how did you know he'd be in the right frame of mind to listen to reason?" "Lucky guess," I said, which was technically true. I'd made an educated guess based on 20 years of teaching teenagers, plus some strategic intelligence about where rich kids go to drink away their problems. Bullshit. This whole thing feels orchestrated. The timing, the evidence package that magically appeared at the police station this morning, the way his father's support network is suddenly evaporating. None of this is coincidence. Sometimes the stars just align, Armin. And sometimes high school history teachers turn out to have very interesting skill sets. His voice had shifted into lawyer mode. Curious, probing, but not accusatory. I'm not complaining, mind you. That kid needed a reality check, and his father needed to learn that money doesn't make you bulletproof. I'm just saying that if I didn't know better, I'd think someone with serious experience in pressure tactics was pulling strings behind the scenes. Hypothetically speaking, I said, if someone did have that kind of experience, what would you think about their methods? Hypothetically, I'd think they were playing by the rules, using publicly available information, and letting the system work the way it's supposed to work, which is more than I can say for the Voss family's usual approach to problem solving. That evening, at exactly 6:47 p.m., Trent Voss walked into the downtown police station looking like someone who'd been hit by the same truck that had run over his life. Armin was with him, playing the role of responsible adult supervising a very stupid child who was finally ready to face the music, according to Detective Ortega, who called me with an update that was definitely not required but deeply appreciated. Trent looked like he'd been crying for about 6 hours straight. His expensive clothes were wrinkled, his hair was a disaster, and he had the hollow-eyed look of someone who'd spent the day staring into the abyss of his own actions. "I did it," he said, and those were the first words out of his mouth when Ortega started the recording. Not, "I want my lawyer," not, "I'm invoking my Fifth Amendment rights," not any of the usual rich kid dodges that money could buy. Just 3 simple words that carried the weight of accountability that he told them everything. The drinking, the racing through downtown at 50 miles an hour, the moment he saw Iris in his headlights and knew he was going to hit her, the split-second decision to flee instead of stopping to help. He signed a full confession, waived his right to an attorney for the initial statement, and actually asked, if Iris was going to be okay. When Ortega told him she would recover, Trent Voss put his head down on the interview table and cried like the scared kid. He really was underneath all the privilege and arrogance. Sometimes the best thing you can do for someone is help them find their conscience, even if they have to dig through a lot of bullshit to locate it. There's something beautiful about watching a perfectly executed plan come together, like watching dominoes fall in slow motion or seeing a complex math equation finally resolve into something elegant and undeniable. At exactly 9 a.m., not 8:59, not 9:01, but precisely on the dot, Detective Luis Ortega received a delivery that was going to make his career and ruin several other people's lives in the most satisfying way possible that I wasn't there to see it personally. Because sitting in a police station while evidence gets delivered might raise uncomfortable questions about how a high school history teacher managed to orchestrate the kind of evidence package that usually requires federal task forces and months of investigation. But Ortega called me 2 hours later, and I could practically hear him grinning through the phone. "Marcus, you need to see this," he said, and his voice had that barely contained excitement that cops get when they stumble onto a case that's going to be talked about in the academy for years. "Can you come down to the station?" "What's going on?" I asked, though I had a pretty good idea. I was sitting in Iris's hospital room, watching her work through some physical therapy exercises that were designed to test her coordination after the concussion. She was moving slowly, carefully, but she was moving, which was more than I'd dared hope for 3 days ago. "Just come down. Trust me, you're going to want to see this." An hour later, I was sitting in an interview room that smelled like burnt coffee and institutional disinfectant, while Ortega spread out evidence like a dealer laying out cards for the world's most satisfying poker game. "It started with a phone call at 8:45, he said, opening the first file folder. "Some lawyer I'd never heard of, Dana Whitcomb, calling to say that evidence related to the Iris Hale case would be delivered within 15 minutes. I thought it was some kind of joke. He pulled out a manila envelope thick enough to choke a horse. Then this showed up. Hand-delivered by a courier service, signed receipt, full chain of custody documentation. Professional as hell. The first item was Trent's phone, complete with location data that showed his exact route through downtown that night. The GPS tracking was like a digital confession. Every turn, every acceleration, every moment of his reckless joyride mapped out with scientific precision. "Look at this," Ortega said, pointing to a series of timestamps. He was doing 63 miles per hour in a 35 zone. The data shows him accelerating through the intersection where he hit your daughter. No attempt to brake, no attempt to swerve. Just straight-up reckless driving. The second item made my jaw clench. Security footage from 3 different businesses along Trent's route, all time-stamped, all showing the same matte black sports car screaming through downtown like the driver thought he was auditioning for Fast and Furious, Rich Kid Edition. The best part, Ortega continued, is this camera from the intersection where the accident happened. He pulled out a USB drive and plugged it into his laptop. High-definition footage of the whole thing. You can see your daughter crossing at the crosswalk, following all the pedestrian signals. You can see Voss's car running the red light. And you can see his face clear as day when he realizes what he's about to do. The footage was brutal to watch. My 13-year-old daughter, backpack over her shoulder, following all the rules and doing everything right, while a 2-ton death machine barreled toward her because some privileged asshole thought traffic laws were suggestions. But it was also undeniable proof of exactly what had happened and who was responsible. There's more, Ortega said, ejecting the USB and pulling out another folder. Toxicology results from a private lab. Apparently young Mr. Voss had the presence of mind to get tested 12 hours after the accident, thinking it would help his case. Turns out he was wrong. The lab results showed a blood alcohol content of 0.12, well over the legal limit, along with traces of cocaine that would have made him even more reckless and impaired. Not only had he been driving drunk, he'd been driving on a cocktail of substances that turned his car into a guided missile. But wait, there's more, Ortega said, grinning like a game show host. We got the car. He led me out to the impound lot, where Trent's matte black Maserati sat like a monument to stupidity and privilege. The front end was crumpled, the headlight was shattered, and there were traces of impact that would match perfectly with Iris's injuries. The crime scene guys are going to have a field day with this, Ortega said, walking around the car like a predator circling wounded prey. Paint transfer, fabric fibers from your daughter's backpack, impact patterns that will let us reconstruct the accident down to the millisecond. But the real prize was hidden in the car's onboard computer system. Modern cars are basically computers on wheels, recording everything from speed to braking patterns to steering inputs. Trent's Maserati had been keeping a digital diary of his driving habits, and that diary was about to become Exhibit A in a criminal trial. The computer shows he was accelerating through the intersection, Ortega explained, pulling up data on his tablet. No attempt to brake, no evasive maneuvers. The impact happened at 52 miles per hour in a 35 zone. Your daughter never had a chance. I stood there looking at the car that had nearly killed my daughter, feeling that cold, precise anger that had been driving me since this whole nightmare began. This wasn't just a case of bad judgment or a moment of panic. This was sustained, deliberate recklessness that could have easily killed Iris instead of just putting her in the hospital. There's one more thing, Ortega said, and his voice had shifted to something more serious. The dashcam footage. He pulled out another USB drive, this one labeled with evidence tape and chain of custody signatures. Apparently, Mr. Voss thought he was clever enough to wipe the camera's memory. Unfortunately for him, he didn't understand how digital storage actually works. The recovered footage was damning in ways that went beyond just the accident. It showed Trent drinking while driving, laughing with someone on his phone about owning the streets, and making jokes about pedestrians being too slow to get out of his way. It was a window into the kind of entitled, sociopathic mindset that viewed other people as obstacles rather than human beings. This is going to trial, Ortega said, ejecting the USB and locking it back in the evidence folder. With this kind of documentation, even a public defender fresh out of law school could get a conviction. Vehicular assault, leaving the scene, reckless endangerment, DUI. This kid is looking at serious time. What about his father? I asked. That's a different investigation, Ortega said, but his smile suggested that other people were already asking very interesting questions about Alistair Voss's business practices. Let's just say that when you shine a bright light in dark corners, you sometimes find more cockroaches than you expected. As I drove back to the hospital, I felt something that had been knotted in my chest since Tuesday night finally begin to loosen. Not relief. That would come when Iris was fully recovered and justice had been served. But satisfaction. The deep, bone-deep satisfaction of knowing that sometimes the system works exactly the way it's supposed to work. Sometimes the good guys win, the bad guys face consequences, and the evidence speaks louder than money ever could. There's a particular kind of poetry in watching an empire built on arrogance and corruption collapse under the weight of its own bullshit. It's like watching a controlled demolition in slow motion. Everything looks solid and permanent until someone hits the right pressure points, and then the whole structure comes down with the inevitability of gravity. Thursday morning started with Alistair Voss, probably drinking his usual $100 a pound coffee and reading the Wall Street Journal while congratulating himself on being a master of the universe. By Thursday evening, he was learning that the universe has a twisted sense of humor and doesn't give a shit about his opinion of himself. The first domino fell at 10:23 a.m., according to the timestamps that Merrick had been tracking for me. Judge Hartley Reeves, the same judge who'd supposedly been in Alistair's pocket deeper than loose change, filed an emergency medical recusal from all active cases, citing unforeseen health complications that required immediate attention. Translation: the judge had suddenly developed a severe case of conscience, probably triggered by the realization that federal ethics investigators were very interested in his recently renovated summer home and the consulting fees his wife had been receiving from companies that mysteriously won a lot of cases in his courtroom. The second domino fell an hour later when the mayor's office announced a comprehensive review of all municipal contracts awarded in the past 5 years. This wasn't unusual. Politicians love announcing reviews and investigations that make them look proactive without actually doing anything. But this review was different because it came with actual teeth, an independent auditing firm, subpoena power, and a mandate to examine not just the contracts themselves, but the entire bidding process. That I was sitting in Iris's room when Merrick called with an update that made me smile for the first time in days. She was working on some homework that her teachers had sent over. Apparently getting hit by a car wasn't a valid excuse for falling behind in algebra, and bitching about how hospital food was a violation of the Geneva Convention. "Your boy's having a rough day," Merrick said without preamble. His board of directors called an emergency meeting for this afternoon. Word is that the Risk Management Committee has some very pointed questions about potential liability exposure. Liability exposure for what? I asked, though I was pretty sure I knew the answer. Everything. The contract irregularities, the campaign contribution patterns, the suspicious judicial rulings. It's all connected, and it all leads back to the same place. Plus, there's apparently a whistleblower hotline that's been pinging with very interesting calls since yesterday morning. I glanced over at Iris, who was glaring at her math homework like it had personally offended her. The bruising on her face was fading from purple to yellow-green, which the doctor said was a good sign. The scar on her arm was healing cleanly, and the physical therapy was going better than expected. She was going to be fine, more than fine, but she was going to carry the memory of this for the rest of her life. "What kind of calls?" I asked. "Construction workers talking about safety violations that got overlooked. City inspectors describing pressure to approve projects that shouldn't have been approved. Accounting staff from various shell companies with very interesting stories about how money moved through the system." Marek's voice had that satisfied tone of someone watching a puzzle solve itself. It's like someone opened a dam and all the dirty water is flowing out at once. The beautiful thing about corruption is that it's a team sport. You can't build an empire of graft and kickbacks by yourself. You need dozens of people willing to look the other way, keep their mouths shut, and pretend they don't see what's happening right in front of them. But the flip side is that when the house of cards starts falling, everyone who was complicit suddenly becomes very interested in saving their own skin. While Merrick was updating me on Alistair's terrible, horrible, no good, very bad day, Detective Ortega was having the kind of afternoon that cops dream about. 3 different federal agencies had reached out to coordinate their investigations: the FBI's White-Collar Crime Division, the IRS Criminal Investigation Unit, and something called the Public Integrity Section that apparently specialized in corruption cases. "It's like Christmas morning," Ortega told me when he called with an update. "Everyone wants to share information, everyone's being cooperative, and everyone's following proper procedures. No shortcuts, no favors, no backroom deals, just good old-fashioned police work." He'd also been contacted by Elliot Park, a cyber forensics specialist who'd worked with federal task forces on major financial crimes. Park had offered to provide technical assistance as a public service, which was government speak for, "I'm going to help you nail these bastards, and I'm not charging for it." This Park guy is something else. Ortega said. He's got the kind of clearance that makes grown prosecutors weep with envy, and he's volunteered to examine all the digital evidence with full chain of custody documentation. Says he wants to make sure everything will hold up in federal court. The cyber forensics part was crucial because modern corruption leaves digital fingerprints everywhere. Email communications, financial transfers, encrypted messages that aren't as encrypted as people think. All of it creates a trail that experts like Park can follow back to its source. But the real knockout punch came from Mira Chun, a forensic accountant who specialized in untangling complex financial schemes. Chun had apparently developed an interest in the Voss Meridian Group's corporate structure after reading some very interesting public filings that had somehow found their way to her attention. She's calling it the most elegantly constructed money laundering operation she's ever seen, Ortega explained. Not technically illegal, but so ethically questionable that it makes the Panama Papers look like a church bake sale. That evening, I sat with Rhea in the hospital cafeteria, picking at a sandwich that tasted like cardboard and watching her process everything that had happened in the past few days. She'd been quiet since Trent's arrest, torn between relief that he was facing consequences and guilt over what was happening to her family. "They're still my family," she said quietly, staring at her untouched coffee. "Alistair may be a bastard, but he's my uncle. I grew up going to his house for Christmas, swimming in his pool during summer barbecues." "I know," I said, reaching across the table to take her hand. "And none of this is your fault, isn't it?" I knew what kind of man he was. I knew how he operated, how he treated people who got in his way. Maybe if I'd said something earlier, then what? You think he would have listened? You think he would have changed? I squeezed her hand gently. "Rhea, your uncle built his empire by convincing everyone around him that corruption was just business as usual. He made it seem normal, acceptable, even necessary. But it was never normal." She nodded, tears starting to form in her eyes. "I just don't want this to turn you into someone I don't recognize." "It won't," I promised, and I meant it. "I'm not doing this for revenge or because I want to destroy your family. I'm doing it because consequences matter. Because justice matters. Because our daughter is lying in a hospital bed, and the person responsible needs to face the music. Do what you have to do," she said finally. "But promise me you won't let this consume you. Promise me you won't become the kind of person who fights monsters by becoming one." "I promise," I said, kissing her forehead. "This ends when justice is served. Not before, but not after either." Outside the cafeteria windows, the city lights were starting to come on as evening settled over downtown. Somewhere in his glass tower, Alistair Voss was probably realizing that money couldn't buy him out of this particular problem. The walls were closing in, and all the influence in the world couldn't stop what was coming. There's something deeply satisfying about watching justice work the way it's supposed to work, like a perfectly tuned engine finally getting the chance to run at full capacity. 6 weeks after Trent Voss turned my daughter into a human speed bump, he stood in Judge Faith Pierce's courtroom looking like someone who'd spent the intervening time getting intimately acquainted with the concept of consequences. He'd lost about 20 pounds, which made his expensive suit hang on him like he was a kid playing dress-up in his father's clothes. His hair was shorter, neater, and he'd developed the kind of nervous tics that come from spending your days in county lockup with people who don't give a shit about your trust fund or your daddy's connections. Judge Pierce had been appointed to replace Hartley Reeves after his sudden departure from the bench. Something about wanting to spend more time with family and pursue other interests, which was judicial code for. "The feds are asking uncomfortable questions about my finances, and I'd like to retain some semblance of dignity before I get indicted." Pierce was everything Reeves wasn't: honest, competent, and possessed of the radical notion that the law should apply equally to everyone regardless of their bank account balance. She'd spent 15 years as a prosecutor before becoming a judge, which meant she'd seen every kind of bullshit defense that money could buy and wasn't impressed by any of it. "Mr. Voss," she said, her voice carrying the kind of authority that made everyone in the courtroom sit up straighter. "You've pled guilty to vehicular assault, leaving the scene of an accident, driving under the influence, and reckless endangerment. Before I impose sentence, do you have anything you'd like to say?" This was the moment I'd been waiting for, not because I wanted to see him grovel, but because I needed to know if he actually understood what he'd done or if this was just another performance designed to minimize his punishment. Trent stood up slowly, And when he spoke, his voice was different from the arrogant kid who'd thought traffic laws were suggestions. Thinner, shakier, but also more honest than anything I'd heard from the Voss family in years. "Your Honor," he began, and I could see his hands trembling as he gripped the podium. "I want to apologize to Iris Hale and her family. I know that words can't undo what I did, can't take back the pain I caused, can't erase the fact that I left a 13-year-old girl bleeding on the street because I was too much of a coward to face what I'd done." He paused, taking a shaky breath, and I saw tears starting to form in his eyes. Real tears, not the crocodile variety that rich kids learn to produce on command. I was drunk. I was high. I was driving like an idiot because I thought the rules didn't apply to me. I thought my father's money could fix anything, could make any problem disappear. His voice cracked slightly. I was wrong about everything. Judge Pierce watched him with the kind of steady attention that judges develop when they're trying to separate genuine remorse from calculated performance. "Go on." "I've had 6 weeks to think about what I did, and I want Iris to know that not a day goes by when I don't think about her. Not a night goes by when I don't see her face in my headlights and wish I could go back and make different choices." He wiped his eyes with the back of his hand, looking more like a scared kid than the entitled asshole who'd nearly killed my daughter. "I know she's going to have that scar for the rest of her life, and I'm going to have to live with knowing I put it there." The courtroom was dead silent except for the scratch of the court reporter's fingers and the distant hum of air conditioning. Even the bailiff, who'd probably seen thousands of sentencing hearings, was paying attention. "I accept full responsibility for my actions," Trent continued. "I'm not asking for mercy, and I'm not asking for leniency. I'm asking for the chance to make this right, somehow, in whatever way I can." Judge Pierce nodded slowly, then opened the file in front of her. "Mr. Voss, the court has reviewed your criminal history, the circumstances of this case, and the victim impact statements submitted by the Hale family. The court has also considered your guilty plea, your cooperation with law enforcement, and the testimony from the counselors and programs you've been participating in during your pretrial detention." She paused, letting the weight of the moment settle over the courtroom like a heavy blanket. "The court finds that your actions on the night in question represent not just a momentary lapse in judgment, but a pattern of reckless behavior enabled by privilege and a fundamental disregard for the safety and welfare of others. You turned your vehicle into a weapon, and you used that weapon to seriously injure an innocent child who was doing nothing more dangerous than walking home from a friend's house." Trent's shoulders sagged, but he didn't look away. Credit where credit's due. He was taking it like a man instead of like a spoiled brat. "However," Judge Pierce continued, "the court also recognizes that you are young, that you have accepted responsibility for your actions, and that you appear to have undergone a genuine transformation during your time in custody. The court believes in redemption, but only when it comes with real consequences." She looked directly at Trent, her eyes boring into him like she could see straight through to his soul. "Therefore, the court sentences you to 3 years in state prison, with the possibility of parole after 18 months if you successfully complete all court-mandated programs and demonstrate continued sobriety and community service." 3 years. Not the slap on the wrist that money usually bought, but not the maximum sentence either. Harsh enough to mean something, but merciful enough to give him a chance at redemption. "Additionally," Judge Pierce continued, "you will establish and fund a road safety education program to be administered through the public school system and named in honor of Iris Hale. You will participate in victim impact programs, maintain complete sobriety, and perform 500 hours of community service upon your release." The gavel came down with the finality of thunder, and just like that, it was over. Trent Voss was led away in handcuffs, but not before he turned to look at me and Rhea in the gallery. He mouthed the words, "I'm sorry," one more time, and for the first time since this whole nightmare began, I actually believed him. Outside the courthouse, my phone rang. Alistair's name appeared on the screen, and for a moment I considered letting it go to voicemail. But curiosity got the better of me. "Alistair, Marcus." His voice was different, smaller, defeated, stripped of the smooth arrogance that had defined every previous conversation. "I wanted to ask you something." "I'm listening. How did you do this? How did you bring down everything I built in less than 2 months?" I looked up at the courthouse steps. where Rhea was talking to Armin Woodard about the civil proceedings that would come next. Iris was at school, back to her normal routine, though she still had a slight limp and would always have that scar on her arm. "I didn't bring down anything, Alistair," I said. "You did." I just refused to look away. There was a long silence, and when he spoke again, his voice was barely above a whisper. "I was wrong about immunity." "Yeah," I said. "You were." I hung up and walked over to my wife, ready to go home and get back to the business of being a family. Justice had been served, consequences had been faced, and sometimes that's all you can ask for. Spring has this way of making everything feel possible again, like the world's been holding its breath through winter and finally remembers how to exhale. The air was crisp and clean, carrying that particular smell of new growth and second chances that makes you believe in things like redemption and fresh starts. I was sitting on the bleachers at Roosevelt High's track, watching Iris jog slowly along the sideline, while Coach Martinez timed her recovery progress. 5 months after a matte black Maserati tried to turn her into street pizza, my daughter was back to doing what she loved, running. Not as fast as before, and not without the slight limp that would probably never completely disappear, but running nonetheless. She'd made it clear to everyone within earshot that some entitled asshole with daddy issues wasn't going to take away the thing that made her feel most like herself. She waved at me with the same hand that had squeezed mine in the ICU while machines beeped out the rhythm of her survival. The scar on her arm caught the afternoon sunlight. A thin, straight line that had faded from angry red to pale silver but would never completely disappear. She wore it like a badge of honor now, proof that she was tougher than anyone had given her credit for. Rhea sat beside me on the bleachers, her shoulder pressed against mine in that unconscious way that couples develop after years of facing the world together. She'd been quiet lately, processing everything that had happened to her family in the aftermath of Trent's sentencing. The Voss empire hadn't just collapsed. It had imploded with the spectacular thoroughness of a controlled demolition. Alistair was facing federal charges for corruption, racketeering, and about 17 other crimes that carried sentences measured in decades rather than years. The board of Voss Meridian had pushed him out faster than a bad one-night stand, and federal regulators had swooped in like vultures on roadkill. The company was being liquidated, its assets frozen, and its employees scattered to the winds like leaves in a hurricane. "Do you think we did the right thing?" Rhea asked, watching Iris complete another lap around the track. "We didn't do anything," I said, taking her hand and threading our fingers together. "The system did what it was supposed to do. Justice ran its course. Consequences happened. You know what I mean." I didn't know what she meant. She was asking if the destruction of her uncle's empire was proportional to what had happened to Iris. She was wondering if 3 years in prison for Trent and federal charges for Alistair was justice or revenge. She was questioning whether the collateral damage, all the innocent employees who'd lost their jobs, all the family relationships that had been shattered, was worth it. "Iris could have died," I said quietly. She was 13 years old, following every rule, doing everything right, and some drunk, high piece of shit nearly killed her because he thought traffic laws were suggestions. Then he left her bleeding on the street like roadkill and went home to daddy to fix his problems. I know. And if we'd let it slide, if we'd taken their blood money and looked the other way, what message would that have sent? That rich kids can kill poor kids as long as they write a big enough check afterward? That justice is for sale to the highest bidder. Rhea squeezed my hand. "You're right. I know you're right. It's hard to watch your family implode, even when they deserve it." The next day, I was back in my natural habitat, room 237 at Roosevelt High, trying to convince 28 teenagers that the American Revolution wasn't just an excuse to blow stuff up and dress like pirates. We were discussing the concept of civic responsibility when Benji Lau, a sharp kid who sat in the back row and asked the kind of questions that made me remember why I loved teaching, raised his hand. "Mr. Hale," he said, "do rich people always get away with it? Like, in real life, not just in movies?" The question hung in the air like smoke from a cigarette, heavy with the weight of adolescent cynicism and the growing awareness that the world wasn't as fair as they'd been told. 28 pairs of eyes turned toward me, waiting for an answer that would either confirm their worst suspicions about how the world worked or give them some small reason to believe in justice. Not when regular people do their jobs, I said, leaning against my desk and looking out at faces that ranged from hopeful to skeptical to completely checked out. Not when evidence is protected and good cops don't quit and prosecutors follow the law instead of following the money. Not when families stand up for each other and communities refuse to look the other way. Sarah Chun raised her hand. But what about when the cops are corrupt? What about when the judges are bought and the prosecutors don't care? Then you find the ones who aren't corrupt, I said. You find the judges who can't be bought and the prosecutors who do care. You shine lights in dark corners and make noise when people want silence. You refuse to accept that corruption is normal or inevitable or just the way things are. But what if you're just one person? Asked Marcus Williams. What if you don't have money or connections or power? What if you're nobody special? I thought about that question, really thought about it, because it was the heart of everything I'd been trying to teach them since September. The idea that citizenship wasn't passive, that democracy required participation, that justice was something you had to work for instead of something that just happened automatically. Here's the thing about being nobody special, I said finally. Nobody special is exactly what the founding fathers were. They were farmers and merchants and lawyers from the ass end of nowhere, taking on the most powerful empire in the world. They weren't special until they decided to be special. I walked over to the window, looking out at the parking lot where teenagers were learning to drive and making the kind of mistakes that would shape the rest of their lives. The system works when people make it work, I continued. When teachers teach and students learn and voters vote and jurors serve and witnesses tell the truth. When cops investigate and prosecutors prosecute and judges judge based on law instead of money. When regular people refuse to accept that corruption is normal. The bell rang, signaling the end of another day, another lesson, another attempt to convince the next generation that they had both the power and the responsibility to make the world better than they found it. That night, I was sitting at the kitchen table grading essays about the rule of law when my phone buzzed with a message from a number I didn't have saved. I knew who it was without looking. I was wrong about immunity. I stared at the screen for a long moment, then deleted the message without responding. Alistair Voss's moment of clarity was his own problem now, not mine. I tucked Iris in, kissed Ria's forehead, and went back to my essays. Because that's what this really was, in the end. Not vengeance, not theatrics, not some kind of action movie revenge fantasy. Just a father keeping his word, a community remembering how justice works, and a teacher trying to make sure his students understood that the system only works when people make it work. And sometimes, if you're lucky and persistent and refuse to accept that corruption is normal, that's enough. Sometimes the good guys win, the bad guys face consequences, and the world becomes a little bit more fair than it was before. That's the lesson I'll teach until I'm gone.